All right, so today's deep dive is going to be interesting. You sent in this video about alcohol and how it affects the body.
Yeah.
And talk about perfect timing, right? With St. Patrick's Day coming up. But what really caught my eye is that it's not just the usual drinking is bad lecture. This one's diving into the actual science.
Yeah, it's actually fascinating. They use real anatomical dissections to illustrate the whole process. So we're not just talking theory here, we're seeing it firsthand.
Exactly. So instead of just being told don't drink, we actually get to see WAYY. I'm all for that. So where does this boozy journey begin?
Well, they start off in a pretty unexpected place, a dissected head. And right off the bat, they address this myth about alcohol absorption, something I'm sure a lot of people wonder about.
You mean like whether we absorb alcohol directly through our mouths? I've always wondered about that.
Yeah, exactly. And it turns out a tiny amount actually does get absorbed through the lining of your mouth. But it's pretty insignificant compared to what happens later on. They even mentioned a study with wine tasters, which I thought was interesting.
Wine tasters as research subjects? Sounds like a tough gig. But okay, so if it's not mainly through the mouth, where does most of the absorption happen?
The stomach. That's where the real action is. The video takes us down the esophagus into the stomach, and they point out those folds in the stomach lining the gastric rugae.
Gastric rugae? Sounds kind of ominous.
Well, they're actually important because they increase the surface area of the stomach. And the more surface area, the faster the alcohol gets absorbed.
Okay, so more surface area equals faster absorption. Makes sense. But isn't there something that controls how quickly stuff moves from the stomach into the intestines?
Absolutely. The pyloric sphincter, it's basically a ring of muscle that acts like a gatekeeper between the stomach and the small intestine.
So if the stomach's the entry point, the pyloric sphincter is like the bouncer deciding who gets into the club.
Exactly. And the deciding factor. Whether there's food in your stomach or not, if you've eaten, the ethanol gets absorbed more slowly. Empty stomach. It's like a free pass into your bloodstream.
Which is why everyone's always saying, don't drink on an empty stomach. But no matter what, eventually all that ethanol ends up in the liver.
Right. And the video did not hold back. They showed an actual dissected liver. Even pointed out that it's the second largest organ in the body.
It's true. The liver's a busy organ constantly filtering and processing everything we consume. And one of its most incredible features is that it can regenerate, repair itself, like a superhero organ with healing powers. But even superheroes have their limits. And that, I'm guessing, is where those enzymes they mentioned come in.
Exactly. The liver uses an enzyme called alcohol dehydrogenase to break down ethanol into something called acetaldehyde.
Wait, acetaldehyde, didn't they say that's even more toxic than the ethanol itself?
They did. Acetaldehyde is actually responsible for a lot of those negative effects we feel from drinking. But luckily, the liver doesn't stop there. It uses another enzyme to quickly convert that acetaldehyde into acetate, which is harmless.
Okay, so it's like a two-step detoxification process with a kind of scary middle step. But what happens if the liver gets overloaded, like during a big night out?
Well, that's where it gets interesting. Because while the liver's busy processing that initial wave of ethanol, some of it actually sneaks into the bloodstream before it can be fully detoxified.
And that's how we end up with a breathalyzer reading. I remember that part of the video where they showed how the ethanol travels from the blood to the lungs and then evaporates into those tiny air sacs. It's kind of freaky when you think about it. We literally breathe out alcohol.
It's a perfect example of just how interconnected our bodies are. But the breathalyzer thing also highlights something else that really stood out to me. Ethanol's reach extends way beyond just the stomach and liver. It gets everywhere.
They did say that, except for bones and fat, if I'm remembering correctly. Still, the fact that it can reach our muscles, spleen, gallbladder, kind of makes you think twice. The whole body effect, not just a localized one.
Absolutely. And of course, we can't forget about the brain. That's where those effects really become noticeable, wouldn't you say?
For sure. So what's actually happening in our brains when that ethanol shows up?
Yeah. Well, the video actually shows us the different parts of the brain, like the cerebrum, cerebellum, all those complex structures. But the key takeaway is how ethanol affects our neurotransmitters.
Right, those chemical messengers that basically control everything in our brains. It's like ethanol's messing with our wiring.
Exactly. And it affects a bunch of them, too. The video talked about dopamine and serotonin. Those are the ones associated with pleasure and mood, which makes sense.
Yeah, because we know alcohol can make you feel euphoric, relaxed, even more confident for a bit. That lines up with what we know about dopamine and serotonin.
Right. But here's where it gets interesting. Ethanol also messes with GABA, which is a neurotransmitter that actually calms the brain down.
Hold on. So it's boosting some neurotransmitters while suppressing others. What happens when GABA gets disrupted?
Well, that's where some of the more, shall we say, interesting behaviors come in. Lowered inhibitions. bad decisions, that feeling of invincibility they talked about, those can all be linked to GABA being thrown off balance.
So it's not just that we make dumb choices when we drink, it's that our brains aren't even working properly to stop us from making those choices in the first place.
Pretty much. And it doesn't end there either. Remember how the video showed the hypothalamus and pituitary gland? Those are like the control centers for our hormones. And guess what? Ethanol messes with them too.
Oh, man. Hormones too. What happens there?
Basically, ethanol triggers a surge in stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline.
So not only is it messing with our brains, it's like putting our bodies on high alert at the same time.
Yep. And those hormonal spikes, especially when it happens a lot, can have long-term consequences that go way beyond just that one night of drinking.
Like what kind of consequences are we talking about here?
Well, for example, having high cortisol levels all the time has been linked to a whole bunch of problems like weight gain, trouble sleeping, even a weakened immune system.
Wow. I never really put those two together.
Yeah.
I mean, I knew stress was bad, but I never realized how much drinking could be playing a part in that whole domino effect.
Yeah. It's definitely complicated, and there's still a lot we're learning.
Okay.
But this video does a good job of showing those connections, and it gets even more complicated when you factor in the effects on other hormones, like ADH, the antidiuretic hormone.
ADH. That's the one that explains why you got to pee every 5 seconds when you're drinking, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
ADH normally helps our bodies hold on to water, but ethanol actually blocks it from being released.
So less ADH means more trips to the bathroom. Got it. But the video also said something about losing electrolytes in the process. What's up with that?
That all comes down to how your kidneys try to get rid of the ethanol. As they work harder, they end up flushing out electrolytes like sodium and potassium along with it. It's like an unwanted side effect of the whole detoxification thing.
So we're not only losing water, we're also losing the stuff that helps us stay hydrated in the first place. No wonder we feel like we got hit by a truck after a night of drinking.
Exactly. And all of that brings us to the dreaded hangover.
Don't remind me. I was kind of hoping for a magic cure from this video.
Yeah.
But it sounds like good old-fashioned time is still the best remedy. Although they did talk about that whole greasy breakfast thing. What's your take on that?
It's a popular one for sure. But honestly, there's not much scientific evidence to back it up. Hangovers are tricky, and even though we know dehydration is a big factor, there's still a lot we don't know about what causes them and why some people are more prone to them than others.
So my usual bacon, egg, and cheese might not be the miracle cure I thought it was. Bummer. So if we still haven't figured out hangovers, what does this all tell us about the whole idea of moderate drinking? This video really makes you think about the impact even just one drink can have on your body. It really makes you wonder where that line is between just enjoying a drink and actually doing something harmful to your body.
That's the big question, isn't it? And this video doesn't shy away from how complex it all is. Even if we're only talking about one beer or one glass of wine, it still sets off this whole chain reaction in our system.
It's like all this stuff happening behind the scenes that we don't even think about. We feel buzzed, maybe a little tipsy, but we don't see all the work our organs are doing to deal with it.
Especially the liver. This is an organ that can actually regenerate itself to a certain extent, and yet we keep throwing alcohol at it. Makes you wonder if we're pushing those regenerative powers too far, and when does it actually become a problem?
Right. Like the video said the liver can repair itself, but it's not invincible. So is there even such a thing as truly moderate drinking if our liver is always having to clean up after us?
It's a tough question, and there aren't any easy answers. This video definitely brought up more questions than it answered, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. It makes us stop and think about what we're putting in our bodies and how those choices affect us, not just right now, but in the long run, too.
I totally agree. And it's not just about the liver either. This whole deep dive really showed how connected everything is. The brain, the hormones, the kidneys, our electrolytes. It's kind of mind-blowing.
For sure. It just goes to show how complex and resilient the human body is, but it also highlights how important it is to know our limits and make informed choices.
Absolutely.
Right.
So to bring it back to our listener, what would you say is the most important thing to take away from this whole ethanol adventure?
I think it's awareness. This video gives us a peek into what happens when alcohol takes a trip through our system. It reminds us that even small amounts can have pretty big effects. And in the end, that knowledge helps us make smarter choices for ourselves.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Knowledge is power.
Right.
So next time you're cheersing with a drink, remember this deep dive? You might even impress your friends with all your new ethanol knowledge.
And maybe chase that celebratory drink with a glass of water. Your body will thank you.
Good advice. Well, on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into the science of alcohol. A huge thank you to our expert for breaking it all down for us.
Happy to be here.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on the deep dive. We'll see you next time.